For 40 years, Kerry Washington carried a feeling she could never fully explain. Not quite belonging. A disconnect she could sense but not name. A gap between herself and the man she called her father that no amount of love on either side seemed to fully close. She was a wanted child. She was a loved child. And yet something in the architecture of her family felt slightly off. A door that would not quite shut. A room she could not find the key to. She built a career playing women who knew exactly who they were. Olivia Pope never doubted herself for a second. But Kerry Washington, off-screen, was carrying a question she did not even know she was asking. A DNA test answered it, not in the way she expected, not by tracing her ancestry back through centuries of history to a specific African nation or a named enslaved ancestor on a plantation. The answer the DNA delivered was closer than that. It was inside her own family. It was in the man who had raised her. And what it revealed, what her parents had kept sealed in silence for 4 decades, recast everything she thought she knew about herself and raised a question that science, for all its power, has not yet been able to close. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Kerry Washington was born on January 31st, 1977, in the Bronx, New York, the only child of Valerie and Earl Washington. Her mother, Valerie, was a professor and educational consultant, a woman of Jamaican heritage whose family carried a layered history of African, English, Scottish, and Native American ancestry woven together across generations in the Caribbean and later in Manhattan. Her father, Earl, was a real estate broker, a Black American man whose family roots traced back to South Carolina before the Great Migration carried them north to Brooklyn. On the surface, it was a straightforward story. A Black American family, 2 parents, 1 child, a Bronx apartment, a path through elite schools, then George Washington University, and then a career that would eventually make Kerry Washington one of the most recognizable actresses in the world. Scandal ran for 7 seasons. Olivia Pope became a cultural phenomenon. Kerry Washington became the first Black woman in nearly 4 decades to lead a network drama series as its star. But underneath that surface story, there was another one her parents had agreed before she was born to take to their graves. In 2018, after wrapping the final season of Scandal, Kerry Washington received an invitation to appear on Finding Your Roots, the PBS documentary series hosted by scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr. The show traces the ancestry of well-known guests through genealogical research and DNA analysis, the same methodology that had produced revelations for dozens of public figures, recovering family histories that had been buried under the silence of slavery and time. Kerry said yes. Her parents initially were excited for her. Then they learned the show would require DNA samples from them as well. Earl Washington began to change. Something shifted in him that Kerry could see but not explain. He had always been a man of quiet reserve, not cold, but contained in the way that some fathers are, holding something back without ever naming what it was. Kerry had spent her life interpreting that reserve as a verdict on her, as evidence that she was somehow not enough. She had built an entire interior narrative around that distance, the way children do when adults will not explain the silences they create. Now, preparing for the DNA collection, that distance became acute. He began having trouble sleeping. He became irritable, withdrawn, reluctant in ways that did not make sense to his daughter. He and Valerie began suggesting they were not sure they wanted to follow through. Kerry could not get to the bottom of it. She told Gates that her father was uncomfortable, that she did not think they were going to agree to it, and Gates did what he always does in these situations. He went to speak to the parents privately. In that private conversation, Earl and Valerie Washington asked Gates a question. They wanted to know whether the possibility that Kerry was not their biological child would come up in the testing. Gates told them what they needed to do. They needed to tell their daughter. In the spring of 2018, In her early 40s, Kerry Washington learned the truth that her parents had been carrying for her entire life. Her father, her beloved father, the man who had raised her, who had been present for every milestone of her childhood and her career, was not her biological father. She had been conceived through a sperm donor. Her parents had tried for years to have a child. When that proved impossible, her mother's doctor had suggested artificial insemination, a medical option that existed in the 1970s but carried, in that era, an enormous social stigma. The procedure was considered risky. It was considered important to remain secret. After it was done, the doctor instructed her parents to go home and have sex so that Earl would have plausible deniability about her parenthood if anyone ever asked. They kept the secret for 4 decades. Valerie had planned a contingency. She had written a note explaining the truth and placed it in a safe deposit box to be opened only after both she and Earl were gone. Kerry would have found out eventually, but she would have found out alone after her parents were dead, holding a piece of paper in a bank vault. That was the plan. DNA prevented it. The secret that was designed to outlast its keepers came to light while they were still alive, while Kerry was still young enough to process it, while there was still time for conversation and confrontation and the difficult, necessary work of understanding. She said she would be forever grateful to Gates. She said that finding out, as painful as it was also liberating, because it finally gave her an explanation for the feeling she had carried for 40 years. The disconnect, the not quite belonging. There had been something in her body that her subconscious had registered and her conscious mind had never been permitted to name. Now it had a name and a question. The sperm donor was black. That was confirmed by her parents. But his identity, the specific man whose DNA Kerry Washington carries in the half of her biology that does not come from Valerie, remains unknown. She searched. She assembled a team of people to help her search. She used every tool available, including the genetic databases that have allowed other people to identify anonymous donors who never expected to be found. As of the publication of her 2023 memoir, Thicker Than Water, the identity of her biological father had not been confirmed. She had no name, no face, no story to attach to that half of herself. The science made the existence undeniable. It could not make the specific identity knowable. That gap between what DNA can prove and what it cannot name is the same gap that runs through every African American family history that crosses the wall of slavery. The mechanism is different. The result is the same. A biological truth confirmed. A human identity still sealed. Now consider the ancestry that did survive. The history that was recoverable, because the story of where Kerry Washington actually comes from, the parts that documents and DNA together can reach, is one that runs through 2 distinct chapters of the African diaspora, through the Caribbean and through the American South, and carries within it the full weight of what that history means. The same science that exposed the secret inside her family also opened a window into the centuries behind it. DNA does not only reveal what is missing, it reveals what has been there all along, encoded in the genome, waiting for the tools capable of reading it. And what it reveals about the Washington and Valerie family lines is a story that connects 2 of the most consequential forced migrations in the history of the Atlantic world, the transatlantic slave trade that built the plantation economies of the American South, and the Caribbean colonial system that built the sugar estates of Jamaica. 2 different geographies, 2 different chapters of the same catastrophe, both of them living in Kerry Washington's bloodline. Her father Earl's family traced its roots to South Carolina before eventually making the journey north to Brooklyn. South Carolina, the Low Country, the rice plantations, the Gullah communities that had preserved West African language and culture in ways almost nowhere else in America had managed. Earl Washington's ancestors had lived through that history. They had been enslaved on that ground. They had emerged from slavery into the decades of sharecropping and Jim Crow that followed emancipation. And then when the Great Migration opened the door north, they had moved from South Carolina to Brooklyn, from the plantation geography that had defined their family for generations to a northern city where something different was possible. That trajectory, South Carolina to Brooklyn, is one of the most common arcs in the story of Black America. Millions of families made it. Each one carried with them the genetic record of everything that had happened on the ground they left behind. The European DNA that entered African American bloodlines through slavery. The specific African origins that the slave trade had severed from memory, but not from the genome. The evidence of a history that was designed to be untraceable, and that DNA has begun, piece by piece, to trace. Her mother Valerie's story runs a different course. Valerie's family came from Jamaica, from the island that carries its own version of the same history, shaped by the same Atlantic slave trade, but filtered through the particular brutality of Caribbean plantation agriculture. Jamaica's sugar plantations were among the most deadly in the entire colonial world. The mortality rate for enslaved people on Jamaican sugar estates was so high that the enslaved population could only sustain itself through continuous importation of new captives from Africa. What that produced, genetically and culturally, was a population drawn from a wide range of African origins: Akan, Fon, Igbo, Yoruba, Mandinka, and others, mixed across generations with European colonizers and their descendants in the same pattern of coerced encounter that shaped every plantation society in the Americas. Kerry Washington's mother is, in her own words, from a mixed race background, partly English, partly Scottish, partly Native American, and descended from enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. Each of those elements represents a specific history. The English and Scottish ancestry traces to the colonizers who came to Jamaica and left biological descendants in the enslaved population they controlled. The Native American ancestry traces to the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and possibly the American mainland, whose histories intersected with those of the enslaved communities around them. And the African ancestry traces back across the Atlantic to the specific nations and peoples whose members were taken and carried to Jamaica across centuries of the slave trade. To understand what that Caribbean history means genetically, it helps to understand what Jamaica specifically was in the context of the Atlantic slave trade. Jamaica was not simply a stop on the trade route, it was one of its most intensive destinations. The British colony of Jamaica became the largest sugar producer in the Caribbean by the 18th century, and sugar production on that scale required an enslaved labor force of staggering size. The mortality rate on Jamaican sugar plantations was catastrophic, so high that the enslaved population could not sustain itself through natural increase and had to be continuously replenished through new importations from Africa. Between 1655 and 1807, when the British abolished the slave trade, more than 700,000 enslaved Africans were transported to Jamaica. The island's population was remade entirely by the trade, and the African origins of that population were drawn from a wide geographic arc: Akan and Fon and Igbo and Yoruba and Mandinka and many others, mixed across generations with the European colonizers who owned them and with the remnants of the indigenous Caribbean populations who had been largely destroyed by earlier colonial violence. That is the deep history that Kerry Washington's mother carries. Jamaican ancestry is never a simple story. It is a compressed record of the Atlantic world's most brutal transactions. Within that Jamaican family tree, one connection stands out. Through her mother's line, Kerry Washington is a cousin of Colin Powell, the former United States Secretary of State, the first Black American to hold that office. He was the son of Jamaican immigrants who built a life on a similar trajectory to Valerie Washington's family. Two lines of Jamaican descent arrived in New York in different decades, and in one generation produced a Secretary of State, and in another produced the actress who played the most powerful fixer in Washington, D.C. on American network television for 7 years. The irony of that is not small. Olivia Pope, Kerry Washington's most famous role was a woman who controlled information, who managed secrets, who seemed to know everything about everyone, and who used that knowledge as her primary instrument of power. Kerry Washington spent 7 seasons playing a woman who never lacked answers, and all the while, she was carrying the biggest secret of her own life without knowing it was a secret at all. Consider what that silence cost her. Kerry Washington has spoken publicly about the years she spent struggling with anxiety, with depression, with an eating disorder that took hold during her college years. She has said that the feeling of disconnect, the sense that something in her body was not quite right, that some information about herself was being withheld, expressed itself as a conviction that there was something wrong with her body that she needed to fix. Not knowing the truth, she turned the mystery inward. She became the problem to be solved rather than the secret to be revealed. That is what decades of silence can do to a child who is sensitive enough to feel what she is not being told. That is the specific cruelty of what her parents did. Not out of malice, not out of indifference, but out of the particular social logic of the 1970s, when artificial insemination was new and frightening, and the dominant medical advice was to erase all evidence of it and make the family look as conventional as possible. The doctor's instruction, go home, have sex, establish plausible deniability, was the medicine of an era that treated the truth as a threat to be managed rather than a fact to be absorbed. Her parents followed that advice faithfully. They followed it for 4 decades. In following it, they left their daughter carrying a feeling she could not name, a disconnection she turned inward on herself, a sense that something in her body was wrong, which contributed, she has said, to the anxiety and depression and the eating disorder that marked years of her life. DNA did not cause those things, but it ended them. The truth that the testing threatened to expose was the same truth that, once spoken, gave Kerry Washington back the part of herself she had been trying to locate since childhood. The gap she had always felt between herself and her father was not a failure, not a deficiency on either side. It was a biological reality that her subconscious had registered, and that the secret had forced her to interpret as something wrong with her rather than something withheld from her. She learned the difference. In her 40s, with her parents still alive and with time available for the conversation that needed to happen, she told her father, her real father, the man who had raised her, and the man she would not be walking away from, that she loved him not because of who he had been pretending to be in her life, but because of who he actually was. That distinction mattered to her. It still does. The biological father remains unnamed, somewhere in a genetic database, or not yet in one, is the man whose DNA Kerry Washington carries in the half of her biology that her parents could not account for. She is still looking. The search is ongoing. The science that unlocked one truth has not yet delivered the other. What it has given her is clarity about the rest. Earl's family traces to South Carolina. Valerie's line traces to Jamaica. The African origins that survive in both, in the specific nations whose people were taken to the American South and to the Caribbean, in the bloodlines that crossed the Atlantic and then crossed each other across generations of plantation life on 2 different islands of the same historical catastrophe. The 1870 census wall that stops most African American family trees from going further back sits somewhere in the Washington family history too. Earl's South Carolina roots run through that wall. The specific enslaved ancestors, their names, their African origins, the precise communities they came from before the slave trade took them, those details are in the same archive of silence that contains millions of other Black American families whose genealogical history was deliberately erased by a system that recorded the economic value of human beings while refusing to record anything else about them. DNA can push past that wall in some cases. It can identify haplogroups and ethnic percentages and genetic matches that point towards specific African regions. Whether that work has been done for the Washington family line, whether the full picture of Earl's South Carolina ancestry has been traced through DNA to specific West African origins, is not yet part of the public record. What is clear is that the history is there, waiting, the way it always is. Kerry Washington knows where she comes from now. More than she did, more than she was permitted to know for the first 40 years of her life. The memoir she wrote about all of it is called Thicker Than Water. The title is not accidental. Blood is thicker than water. The proverb that insists biological connection is the deepest bond there is. Kerry Washington chose that phrase for a book about discovering that one of her deepest bonds was not biological at all. The man who raised her, the man she called her father, the man she told after the truth came out that she was not going anywhere. That title is an argument. It is a rejection of the idea that DNA defines belonging. It is the same argument that sits at the heart of every ancestry investigation that recovers what slavery erased. The insistence that identity is made of more than genetics, that belonging is built through love and time and choice as much as through bloodline, that the genome tells one story and the life tells another, and both of them are true. The one piece still missing is the one her parents could not give her, and the science has not yet found a name, a face, a story that belongs to half of who she is. History has confirmed that half exists. It has not yet said who it was.